3 years ago, a fellow Australian complained that the rest of the world should not have to know the name Bari Weiss. It was part of a highly entertaining rant titled "I Should Be Able to Mute America," about how America is ruining the internet. And I agreed with many of his sentiments, but alas, America still dominates the internet, and the name Bari Weiss has only become even more widely known to anyone following US news online. Which probably upsets this guy too.
Literally no one should care about Bari Weiss. To a regular person, why would anyone care about any of this? How less important to a real working class American could the thoughts or opinions or resignations of Bari Weiss be? I can't think of anything less important.
Now, I'm not a working class American, and I'm not saying Bari Weiss is the most important thing, but I think she's important enough to take a look at this channel. Welcome to the Internet Reviewed, where I'm taking a look at the online world, one content creator or outlet in this case at a time, to help you know who's worth following and when to smash that mute button. Today's subject is, Bari Weiss, and the new media company she founded with her wife, Nellie Bowles, called The Free Press, which has been remarkably successful in a pretty short amount of time, and I think is trying to do something quite interesting in the online space.
The people that can kind of marry the intellectual freedom of the Wild West world without giving into the conspiratorial rabbit hole tendencies that capture much of that world, and can marry that genuine freedom with the responsibilities that come with the best parts of the legacy press. Like, I think that the opportunity for that is just enormous. And that's what we're really, really trying so hard to do.
In just 3 years, the Free Press has gone from being Bari's personal newsletter, initially called Common Sense, to a full-blown media company employing around 60 people and valued at $100 million.
The business model is super simple. It's to treat readers like adults and to trust them with complicated information, and to trust that a large number of Americans don't simply want political heroin that like feeds their fix, but they actually want real stories about the world. And the world is a complicated place.
Of course, Bari herself is a big personality and a big part of the brand. She's been called the Queen of Free Speech and an anti-woke warrior, a provocateur the left loves to hate, and the Jewish female version of Kanye West. Put it this way, even Russell Brand finds her a bit full on.
You're very, very intense, and I really like communicating with you. Yeah, you're really, really an intense person. It's good to deal with you.
I don't know if that's bad or good.
Whatever your views on Bari, it's pretty clear that she's tapped into something with the Free Press, which bills itself as being built on the ideals that were once the bedrock of American journalism. The Free Press is now a news site, a producer of podcasts with big-name guests. It puts out documentaries and video content and does live events.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited to welcome you to the first ever Free Press live debate.
The Free Press recently hit 1 million subscribers on Substack.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much to all 1,023 of you.
With its paying members bringing in around $10 million a year. It is the #1 US politics publication on that platform, just ahead of Heather Cox Richardson's Letters from an American, which I have reviewed before. You can check that out here. But to understand the Free Press and what it's aiming for, you need to know a bit about who Bari Weiss is and what drove her to start it. So let's start there.
People are just desperate for some sanity. And that's like broadly, I think, what we're offering.
Firstly, it's important to note some background and context to her general worldview. Bari is Jewish, very passionately pro-Israel, and has long been concerned with anti-Semitism. Her first taste of the media came during her college years when she was involved in Zionist activism, which she has said is what got her into journalism in the first place.
So I figured I would talk a little bit about my own story and how my Zionist activism connected to my journalism. And I got involved in journalism very much through activism. To me, without Jewish memory and imagination, there is no Zionism. And that's, I think, where the work of journalists, to some extent, come in, which is reminding people about that history and finding new Jewish heroes, Zionist heroes, and stories to tell. And I think it's also about reminding people the truth of that history.
I just think that's a relevant piece of context and perspective to know about when you're taking a look at Bari and her work. Let's move on.
I am a girl from Pittsburgh. I'm the oldest of 4 daughters. I am a longtime journalist who spent her career at fancy prestige publications like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And in the very hot, I would say hot politically, summer of 2020, I left the New York Times in a very public way with a very public resignation letter, a little a la Jerry Maguire, and really sounded the alarm on things that were happening inside the most important journalistic institution in the country.
Now, you might remember in the movie Jerry Maguire, he prints out 100-odd copies of his mission statement to hand out at the office.
That's how you become great, man. Hang your balls out there.
Thanks. Everybody got a copy.
But Bari hung her balls out on the internet, publishing her resignation letter from the New York Times, where she'd been an opinion editor and writer, on her own website for the whole world to see.
Dear AG, it is with sadness that I write to tell you that I am resigning from the New York Times.
I'll link to it in the blurb below so that you can read it in full for yourself. Just some quick background. She'd been hired by the Times in the wake of Trump's first election in 2016, which the paper, like many others, had not seen coming. Her job was to try to bring a more reflective spread of the country's opinions to its pages. And not everyone loved that. Bari complained of bullying by colleagues who disagreed with her views, of Twitter, which at the time was very much a left-leaning platform, being the paper's ultimate editor, and of the difficulties in getting anything published that did not explicitly promote progressive causes.
A new consensus has emerged in the press, but perhaps especially at this paper, that truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else.
Bari's letter got some pretty snarky responses from left-wing commentators who said that it showed she was really a conservative, a right-winger, and a hypocrite.
Now she's saying, no one should be allowed to criticize me.
I just want to say I don't think that is a fair characterization at all of what she'd said.
It's going to be perfect for her. She's going to play the victim card, and right now a lot of the press is going along with it. Poor Bari Weiss. Did you know she was criticized for her opinion?
But beyond the snark, her resignation sparked a big conversation about some of the problems with legacy media institutions, especially liberal ones, in the digital age. And there were even readers of the New York Times itself who recognized that.
I read Bari Weiss's resignation letter with, well, a sense of resignation and elation. Resignation because you're losing a fresh, skeptical voice. Elation because she called you out on your new toxic woke culture and put her money where her mouth is. I identify as a left-leaning centrist. My education trained me to greet the world with an open mind. I believe in dialogue, not debate. And as a Times reader since college, I can see it plain as day. The Times has largely abandoned dialogue when it comes to cultural issues and ideas. You've handed the keys to America's greatest paper to a strident, new orthodoxy that will not tolerate intellectual diversity.
Now, Bari didn't actually use the word woke in her resignation letter, but she used it enough elsewhere to make clear that she saw online wokeness or the illiberal left as a big problem. And I think that observation was a fair one. Okay, just do a quick side note while Kenny interrupts me. Yes, I do think woke is a real thing. I think it's an overused term and sometimes inaccurately used, and I don't want to waste time in this video defining it, so I will instead direct you to this piece by Freddie DeBoer.
Of course you know what woke means. I'd rather use any other term at this point, but can we get real, please?
I think he does a really great job of laying it out there. And by the way, you can watch my review of Freddie DeBoer here. But back to Bari and her resignation. I do just want to spend a moment setting this up because I think it's important context for the free press. Remember the timing of this. It was 2020. It was the final year of the first Trump administration, the start of the COVID pandemic, the year of George Floyd's murder, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, and a whole lot of social unrest. I maintain there was only one thing that could bring people together in 2020, and it was this incredibly powerful video from Madonna.
That's the thing about COVID-19. It doesn't care about how rich you are, how famous you are, how funny you are, how smart you are. where you live. It's the great equalizer. And what's terrible about it is what's great about it. What's terrible about it is it's made us all equal in many ways.
A naked celebrity pontificating about the egalitarian spirit of a deadly virus from a pedal-filled milk bath? Chef's kiss. But outside of that unifying moment, I think it became pretty clear there were some fairly reasonable things that you couldn't say or even ask in certain liberal or progressive circles without facing some pretty unpleasant and unfair backlash. Bari was hardly the only one speaking up about this sort of attitude and the chilling effect it was having at some media outlets. There was actually a whole wave of mainstream journalists leaving to become independent around that time for similar reasons, but Bari was certainly one of the loudest.
You write, there are tens of millions of Americans who aren't on the hard left or the hard right who feel the world has gone mad. So in what ways has the world gone mad?
Well, when you have the chief reporter on the beat of COVID for the New York Times talking about how questioning or pursuing the question of the lab leak is racist, the world has gone mad. When you're not able to say out loud and in public that there are differences between men and women, the world has gone mad. When we're not allowed to acknowledge that rioting is rioting and it is bad, and that silence is not violence, but violence is violence, the world has gone mad.
I do want to say that I think Bari was rhetorically overreaching there to say the world had gone mad. There were definitely places in the world you could say those sorts of things. The issue, let's be specific about it, was saying them in liberal elite or progressive spaces. But it was becoming clear that outside of those bubbles, regular people were hungry for more nuanced and reasonable coverage of these sorts of thorny cultural issues.
I experienced it for the first time around the Me Too movement, where, I'm a lifelong feminist. And yet, I thought this very notion of believe all women reflexively was like an anti-humanist position and really in a way like just didn't square with reality. Like, women can lie just like everybody else. And it doesn't mean that the Me Too movement, wasn't in many ways virtuous and wasn't in many ways overdue. But I remember writing pieces around that time. I specifically one called Aziz Ansari is guilty of not being a mind reader that went very viral.
Just to remind you what this was all about, a story had come out detailing an anonymous woman's account of an unwanted sexual encounter with the actor Aziz Ansari. Now, Bari's view was that this was a story about bad sex, but not necessarily sexual assault, and that lumping it in with the Me Too movement
transforms what ought to be a movement for women's empowerment into an emblem for female helplessness.
Which turned out to be a view many shared.
And sort of for the first time made me think, oh, wow, like things that I think are commonsensical in the world and that most people in the country would sort of nod along with and be like, yeah, isn't that obvious? Like in the framework of the New York Times felt like incredibly radical.
He's back. But just to finish with what I think is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that this really was a time of unsayable things and, yes, cancel culture, let me remind you of the David Shaw saga. This was the case of a Democrat-aligned pollster who was accused of racism for tweeting research that showed Democrats benefited more from nonviolent protests and were harmed by rioting. That seems a fairly non-controversial piece of information, but he literally lost his job over it, even after apologising.
I regret starting this conversation and will be much more careful moving forward.
So all of this is to say that I understand Bari's reaction to that cultural environment. I think it was warranted, and I think it was clear that there was a potential audience out there wanting something else. Which brings me, finally, to the free press, which is what she's offering them instead.
I like the free press.
The free press.
The free press. My friend Bari Weiss.
And she's a founder of the Free Press. Nellie Bowles is here.
I'm Bari Weiss, and this is Honestly.
Here's the way this is going to work. We're going to get into it. We're going to mix it up. Let's see who can change more minds.
It looks like a gay Olympics. It looks amazing.
My name is
Tracy, Mallory,
Jonah,
Rob,
and I subscribe to the Free Press.
That was their ad, but here's what I think. Firstly, let's take a look at what the free press claims to be.
We publish investigative stories and provocative commentary about the world as it actually is, with the quality once expected from the legacy press, but the fearlessness of the new. We focus on stories that are ignored or misconstrued in the service of an ideological narrative. You won't agree with everything we run, and we think that's exactly the point.
The Free Press has an explicit list of values: honesty, curiosity, respect, hard work, independence, excellence, common sense, and belief in the American project. I think most news organisations would share most of those aims, but I do want to single out two of them as worth commenting on. The first one is respect, which the Free Press expands on saying, "We assume good faith." I like this because I think one of the biggest problems with discourse today is the default assumption of bad faith in others when they disagree with our views. So I like seeing this explicitly stated as an aim. The other value I want to comment on is this one, which is the most ideological one there.
Belief in the American project. Our reporting and opinion can be harshly critical of our country and its leaders, but that is because we believe deeply in America and its promise. We make no apology for making distinctions between good and bad, liberalism and illiberalism, the rule of the law and mob rule, freedom and unfreedom, and we advocate forcefully for the former.
I like that being laid on the table so that you know what their editorial worldview is. And I think it's a good one to keep in mind when we take a look at their content more broadly. So let's start doing that now. And spoiler, I have complicated views about it. Looking at their own topics list, most are, again, fairly standard, but I'd note that free speech, Israel and anti-Semitism, and sex and gender get their own billing. So that gives you some idea of their priorities. You can see here the spread of stories they've published from a range of writers and reporters in just the last week. The Free Press has a video series called Ben Meets America, where a journalist travels the country in an attempt to understand the American electorate. That's involved talking to RFK Jr. voters in California.
The guy is an absolute genius.
Cops and drug users on the streets of San Francisco.
What is fentanyl like?
Great. I mean, I don't know how to explain it. Like, it's scary. In a sense, it's not scary when you're high. I smoke it.
Does any part of you want to stop using it?
I guess like to an extent, you know, like I want to better my life, you know, like I want to be happy.
And climate protesters in New York.
If you came and you were actually interested in Extinction Rebellion, then you would have reached out to us ahead of time.
Perhaps most famously, the Free Press first ran the account of Jamie Reed, a former case manager at a transgender clinic in a children's hospital who alleged that children were being too hastily or inappropriately put onto hormonal treatments.
I thought I was saving trans kids. Now I'm blowing the whistle.
That became a pretty huge and consequential story that was picked up right across the media. As one observer put it,
"The Reed story is a perfect encapsulation of how progressive activists managed to override truth-seeking norms for the sake of what they believe to be social justice, and why the Free Press, or something like it, needs to exist."
The Free Press exclusively obtained letters written by Russian dissident Alexei Navalny while he was in prison before he was killed, died of natural causes, as the Putin regime insists.
"I understand that I am not the first, but I really want to become the last, or at least one of the last, of those who are forced to endure this."
Those letters were an incredibly profound and intimate record of what courageous people will endure in a fight for freedom. The Free Press has run debates on topics like,
does the West need a religious revival?
And
should the US still police the world?
And on more specific questions, such as whether deporting Mahmoud Khalil is just and necessary or sets a dangerous precedent for free speech. I think the Free Press has a particular strength in its commitment to publishing a diversity of thoughtful perspectives on difficult social issues that are otherwise taken up by culture warriors. Their podcast offerings, especially Honestly with Bari Weiss, is a particular good vehicle for this. One great example of this was the real story of the Central Park Karen. I'm sure you remember this. This was the story about the white woman walking her dog through Central Park, and she'd called the police on a black bird watcher who'd reprimanded her for having the dog off leash.
Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
The fallout from that was so bad that the woman lost her job and had to flee the country. But the Free Press unpacked the mob mentality that had defined the case and instead took a closer and more humane look at the people involved.
This was a fascinating report, not because it portrays either Ms. Cooper or Mr. Cooper as a saint, but because it shows the way a viral video and the ensuing mob justice take on a life of their own, with little regard for the original context.
Great podcast. I think both Coopers are decent people who got caught up in subjective states of mind as the situation escalated, each jumping to quick conclusions about the other's intentions.
I thought their 7-part podcast series, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling by Megan Phelps-Roper, was excellent. I found it a calm, thoughtful exploration of the culture war around trans issues, involving the perspective of trans people, such as Natalie Wynn of the excellent YouTube channel ContraPoints, and with J.K. Rowling herself.
I never set out to upset anyone. However, I was not uncomfortable with getting off my pedestal. And what has interested me over the last 10 years, and certainly in the last few years, the last 2-3 years, particularly on social media, you've ruined your legacy. Oh, you could have been beloved forever, but you chose to say this. And I think you could not have misunderstood me more profoundly.
I found it fascinating, actually, hearing J.K. Rowling articulate her views more thoughtfully. I felt she expressed herself far more reasonably and clearly than she does on Twitter. Honestly, I don't know why people tweet. And I thought the people they had pushing back on her claims and positions were incredibly impressive too. I've seen some criticism claim the series favoured J.K. Rowling. I disagree. I didn't get that impression. I found it a refreshingly mature approach to a topic that had been toxic for so long. And just finally, even though the Free Press isn't really equipped to sort of do rolling coverage of breaking news, it at times has. Even the New York Times noted the Free Press had quite impressively covered the attempted assassination of Donald Trump.
After the attempted assassination of Mr. Trump, the company's all-hands response showcased the muscles it has built since its modest beginnings. Within 48 hours, Ms. Weiss's team had published a first-person account from the rally, a meditation on past near-miss attacks against presidents, an essay mapping the parallels between 2024 and 1968, a piece imploring Americans to turn down the temperature, and a column by the historian Niall Ferguson, the site's splashiest recent hire.
So, I think it's fair to say that the Free Press is putting out some genuinely good work, especially in the spaces that wokeness drowned out. But it's not 2020 anymore. The balance of cultural and political power has shifted in America. And when I consider their output in the wider context of what's going on in that country and the world at the moment, I can't help but feel there are a few areas in which they're lacking. Now, the first one isn't all that surprising, given Bari's very clear pro-Israel position, but I'll note it nonetheless. The outlet has done a lot of first-hand reporting about the Israel-Hamas war. It has interviews with survivors of the October 7 attacks, with the families of hostages. It's talked to Palestinians in the West Bank, done long-form interviews with the likes of a Muslim Israeli woman and a reformed Hamas militant. And this coverage is paying off. Reportedly, their traffic and subscriptions have surged during the Israel-Hamas war. But you don't see a huge amount from the Palestinian perspective or addressing the allegations against Israel of genocide or of the pretty shocking number of journalists who've been killed in Gaza. And it just seems to me that an outlet called the Free Press might have a bit more to say about that. They certainly have published some criticism of Israel, so credit where it's due. One of the most strident was a piece they ran by Andrew Sullivan titled, "How Many Children is Israel Willing to Kill?" That piece acknowledged the atrocities of Hamas and Israel's right to self-defense, but it noted,
"But when you see the sheer scale of the punishment, the inherently indiscriminate nature of the bombing, the wholesale destruction of close to everything, the disproportionate impact on children, and the looming spectre of mass starvation and disease, it's hard not to conclude that we are witnessing a war crime that will further delegitimize Israel in the region and beyond. We are funding it, while we apparently have little control over it."
Not all readers of the Free Press liked that view, but there were quite a few who were grateful that it was published, and some who felt there ought to be a bit more of that sort of thing.
An excellent balanced article by Sullivan. Kudos to Bari Weiss for letting him write this, even if it very much against her own beliefs. That's a level of maturity I really respect.
I highly recommend the editors of the Free Press to read the comments to this article to understand the strong bias of their audience and reflect on it. I also thank you for posting this article. I confess I have been utterly disenchanted with the great promise of the Free Press. Posting this article goes some way to reminding me why I like this publication.
The second thing that I think is a problem at the Free Press is that it can try a bit too hard to be open-minded and isn't applying enough skepticism or pushback to people who aren't just offering alternative points of view, but are offering alternative realities, not based in fact. There are quite a few examples I could give you of this, but I'll give one that I'm very well across because I recently reviewed the person involved. The food babe, also known as Vani Hari, who has recently become a key member of RFK Jr.'s MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again movement.
And Vani is the founder of True Vani. You might also know her from her writings as Food Babe. She has more than 2 million followers on Instagram. And you may remember her as the woman that got Subway to remove, tell me the name of the chemical.
Azodicarbonamide.
Exactly, otherwise known as the yoga mat chemical from its breads. The idea that there was a yoga mat chemical in a bread is kind of the whole purpose of this conversation. So
now, Vani Hari is a wellness blogger with no health or nutrition or science qualifications. I think she has good intentions, but is incredibly misguided. She's almost comically scientifically illiterate and makes a number of false claims about food companies poisoning people while promoting her own products, often containing the very same ingredients she claims are toxic. But you wouldn't know any of that reading about her at the Free Press or watching that panel interview that Bari Weiss did with her, where there was basically no pushback on her claims. So I think that is a problem. And it seems a fair few of the Free Press's members do too.
Letters to the editor. Make America Healthy Again gets the facts wrong. We heard from several listeners who took issue with some, and in some cases a lot, of what the proponents of the New Age health regime said.
The third area in which I think the Free Press is falling a bit short is in holding this version of the Trump administration to account. Because I don't know if you've been paying attention, but there's some pretty authoritarian-ish stuff happening. And as the avowed believers in the American project, remember, this is their own stated value and in the rule of law over the mob, I'd have thought some of this stuff would be a bit more prominently covered by the Free Press than it seems to be. What sort of stuff do I mean? Okay, how about a sitting president's attempts to punish law firms that have represented clients acting against him?
I just think that the law firms have to behave themselves. And we've proven that. We have others that want to make a settlement also. They, having to do with the election and other things, they behave very badly, very wrongly.
The judge who blocked those parts of Trump's executive orders described them as chilling and threatening the very foundation of our legal system. The one article about it at the Free Press acknowledges that it's blatantly unconstitutional, but reads almost sympathetically to Trump. How about people being picked up off the street, driven away and put in prison without any due process whatsoever? This stuff is happening at the moment in America. The Trump administration put hundreds of people, including at least one that we now know is innocent, onto a plane in the dead of night and flew them to an overseas torture chamber. And that is hardly hyperbole if you've read anything about El Salvador's prisons. And this was done while legal proceedings were ongoing, a move that implied a desire to circumvent judicial review, according to a judge. But when the Free Press writes about the Venezuelan deportations, it quibbles over whether it's really a crisis or not.
The term constitutional crisis has been so abused and overused, it is losing all meaning. The Venezuelan deportation may be unconstitutional, as I'll explain below, but it's not a crisis.
And I get the desire not to be hysterical, but the Free Press has a whole section on its site titled Campus in Crisis about what students at universities are doing. And it just feels like maybe there ought to be one on what the people with actual power running the actual country at the moment are doing. You know, one of the things Bari complained about in her resignation letter to the New York Times was the paper's running of 4,000 op-eds arguing that Donald Trump is a unique danger to the world. And I guess I'm just saying that I don't think you have to have Trump derangement syndrome to be seeing some evidence this time around that maybe he is a unique danger. I don't think she needs to run 4,000 op-eds about it, but it could probably do with some more serious editorial attention. Sometimes the most attention this stuff seems to get at the Free Press is a jokey aside in their TGIF column.
Normally, I follow the Peter Thiel doctrine of taking Trump seriously, not literally. But he's the president giving this speech on locking up journalists to the Department of Justice staff. It does feel kind of literal now. Peter, King Thiel, please help. I want to see mainstream media reporters fail just as badly as the next Substack reactionary, but I don't want them jailed. Then we'll get so many jail memoirs.
And I know they're being facetious there, but I will note that the mainstream media is doing a much better job covering this issue than they are. Now, that Peter Thiel reference leads me to the final issue that I think the Free Press has, which is to do with its financial incentives and relationship with the tech industry. A main complaint I have in this area is that the Free Press seems to have sort of kid gloves on when it comes to covering Elon Musk's role in the Trump administration and the chaotic and damaging approach of the boys of Doge. In an editorial titled 2 Cheers for Doge, the outlet said,
Doge's decision to go after federal spending with a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel is having its foreseeable hiccups.
Hiccups seems a bit of an understatement to me when you actually look at some of the real-world consequences that have come about thanks to Doge. And there were at least a few commenters who felt similarly to me on this one.
The Free Press's credulous acceptance of the savings presented by Doge on their wall of receipts is simply unworthy of an allegedly impartial institution of journalism.
Quit taking money from billionaires. You guys really blew this.
What billionaires? Well, reportedly, the vast majority of the Free Press's business comes from subscriptions. However, the company has raised $15 million with investors, notably with some rich tech guys who support Donald Trump. Guys like David Sachs and Mark Andreessen. It's also partnering with companies like Airbnb and Uber to sponsor its podcasts. Now, the Free Press does run pieces critical of the tech industry, but even if these relationships with those who hold a lot of money and power in America today aren't compromising the outlet's editorial integrity, they're appearing to, for some. When the Free Press threw an inauguration party earlier this year, they described it as a fabulous bash in partnership with Uber and X. But when Bari Weiss posted photos from the event, other people saw it a bit differently.
Bari Weiss, a bold truth-teller banished by the elites for her iconoclast, fearsome opinions. This is what happens to people who take on centers of power. They are forced to party with large corporations, senators, and miscellaneous famous people.
Bari Weiss talks a lot about wanting to avoid audience capture. I think she's sincere in that desire, and I'm going to play the next clip along so that you can hear her out for yourself and make up your own mind.
How do you avoid audience capture? How do you avoid drifting towards crazy town?
For me, it's been about not making it Bari Weiss Inc. Like it's, as I said, there are 20 people that work here and they're not just like producing this show. There's one producer full-time on this show. There are reporters who we want to make into, superstars. There are, hosts of other shows that we're developing. The goal is to sort of make it the Justice League of people that want to do old school, independent-minded, fearless journalism. And for me, that's the trick. Like if 2 or 3 years from now, someone sends someone a link from the Free Press and my name's not invoked and it has authority on its own, like that's really the goal. And for me, like I have strong opinions about like 10 subjects. There are hundreds of other subjects that I either know nothing about or bore me, or I'm just completely out of my depth. And so for me, it like this formulation just makes a lot of sense. And I also think it guards you against audience capture because there are 20 people here with 20 extremely different views about, say, the war in Ukraine or, American foreign policy. This is just like a topic we've been talking a lot about. And that back and forth, I think, keeps you really honest because otherwise you're kind of just hearing yourself and then hearing the audience talk back to you. But it's also a matter of just like, frankly, like discipline and a real sense of like what your North Star is, because it was super clear to me from the early days of this that like I could probably run a piece about how bad cancel culture is every single day and make a lot of money doing it and like maybe afford a second home for my family. But then I had a kind of like moment of confronting myself the way I had at the New York Times and saying like, but wait, like, wouldn't this be replicating exactly the thing that I criticized those people for doing? And like, I've seen enough people become caricatures of themselves. Like, I don't want to do that, even if it does afford me a second home. Like, I'd much rather try and build something that lasts, to try and build a new institution in a world in which our faith in the old ones has crumbled.
It's still early days at the Free Press, so I guess the question is how successfully she manages to do all of that, and whether the Free Press can truly uphold its promise of honesty, doggedness, and fierce independence. I think Jonathan Chait's warning here is spot on.
To build a worldview entirely in reaction to the excesses of one side is eventually to cooperate in the excesses of the other.
Overall, what's my verdict? Well, it's complicated. I think the Free Press is an understandable but flawed response to the failings of liberal legacy media. I think it puts out some really good and necessary journalism, but has significant blind spots, some misguided priorities, and at times fails to live up to its own values. So not all that unlike other media outlets, I suppose. I think they're a great outlet to follow as long as you stay mindful of their editorial bent and blind spots. Just make sure you have a varied news diet so that you get whatever they're not giving you somewhere else. And if you're a Free Press subscriber, let them know when you think they're falling short. If they're serious about their mission, maybe they'll make some changes. Fingers crossed.
Freedom is good, but you also need responsibility. And you need both of those things to have an institution that is worthy of trust. And that's really what I'm trying to do.
That's all from me for now. Let me know what you think in the comments. This was a pretty big topic, so I'm sure there are some key points I've missed or things I've got wrong or maybe I've been unfair about. Let me know if you think so. And you can always email me at theinternetreviewed@gmail.com if you have any suggestions or requests for who you'd like to see me review next.
Come on, go. Let's go eat some fried fish. Fried fish. Come on, road and go. Let's go eat some fried fish. Fried fish.